The 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had ordered them. When they all saw him, they worshipped, but they doubted. Then Jesus approached and said to them, "All power in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always, till the end of the age." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Morning, everyone. Today is the Feast of Holy Trinity Sunday, and as I was preparing for Mass this week, I was trying to imagine what it was like for you guys in the past on Holy Trinity Sunday, and I'm sure that you're probably used to Father Shockley giving long and in-depth theological treatises that are extremely relevant to all of us and extremely clear and seeming like a lecture. And I wondered, maybe if you guys would permit me, I'm not going to give a lecture on the Trinity today. That's okay. I'd rather take advantage of the homily series we've been doing, talking about reasons to be Catholic and reasons to believe. As you know, beginning at Easter, I started talking about the truths of the Catholic faith, how we know that God is real, Jesus is the one true Lord, He established a church. And since then, we've been talking about the goodness of the Catholic Church, that the church is a force for the good in the world. And I think it's kind of fitting that actually on this Memorial Day weekend, in which we give thanks for those who've sacrificed their lives for us, we also spend some time recognizing the great contributions of our church for our civilization. The church is one of the greatest forces for the good. In fact, the church, I would argue, is the greatest instrument of progress in the history of the world. And I want to talk about that this morning. And that might seem a little bit strange to many of us. In our modern culture, many times we're told the opposite, that the church has been the opponent of progress. Many of us, when we went through school, for example, we learned all about the great ancient Roman Empire, and then we heard about the Dark Ages, in which the church ruled civilization. And then, thanks be to God, we had the secular Renaissance and the Enlightenment, when all of us were rescued from the tyranny of the church we experienced in the Dark Ages, right? Many of us are unknowingly given that theory of history in school. And many times when we hear that, our teachers completely ignore the fact of what happened in the 19th and 20th centuries, when the world truly did become more and more secular. We saw the horrible world wars. We saw the horrible secular tyrannical regimes in Nazi Germany and communist Russia and other places. And yet people still think that the church is the enemy of progress. Couldn't be further from the truth. So I want to spend some time talking about that today. I want to highlight at least two ways in which the church has been the greatest instrument of progress in the history of the world. The first way I would say is with regards to human dignity. Right? Many of us, we take for granted today how special it is that all of us have a recognition of equal human dignity amongst all persons, no matter what their gender is, no matter what their race is, no matter where they're from. Everyone should be considered as deserving of human dignity, with certain inalienable human rights. Where do those come from? Even though we might recognize it, much of that comes from the influence of the church. For example, many modern sociologists today make the argument, recognizing that, for example, slavery. Sometimes many of us think that slavery was kind of unique to the United States. Not the case. Slavery has been very commonplace throughout the history of the world, and many modern sociologists have made the argument that if it were not for Christianity, it's hard to imagine how slavery would have ever been eradicated in the first place. It is because of Christianity, people like St. Paul, who first said that there is no more Jew or Greek, there's no free or slave, but all are one in Christ Jesus. Right? The beginnings of the development of the understanding of equal human dignity. In fact, many people don't realize that in the Middle Ages, in Christian Europe, so says one famous sociologist, Rodney Stark, that slavery had essentially been eradicated in Christian Europe in the Middle Ages. It actually didn't return until the modern age when the New World began to be colonized and people began to be enslaved. And once again, it was condemned by the papacy in a papal bull, which many people don't know about because it was kind of pushed under the rug by many colonists, even Catholic colonists, unfortunately. But it's hard to imagine how slavery could have ever fully been eradicated if it hadn't been for those Christian principles. Another way the church has influenced human dignity is with the rights of women, which again is the opposite of what many of us think today. Some people think that the church has oppressed women or it's held women back, especially because we don't have women priests. Again, the opposite is true. Ever since the beginning of Christianity, the establishment of the church, for the first time perhaps in the history of the world, men were no longer allowed to have multiple wives. Right? Commonplace in the ancient world that men could have various wives, but of course women could only have one husband. It wasn't until the advent of the church that those equal human rights became recognized. That just like women can't have multiple husbands, so likewise men can't have multiple spouses either. Even in church law, when it comes to marriage, the church teaching on marriage, as developed throughout the Middle Ages, is that nobody can be forced into a marriage. Because in order for a marriage to be valid, the person entering into it has to be completely freely choosing it. Otherwise, it's not really a marriage. Any of you have ever dealt with annulments, you know this. That's one of the grounds for an annulment, as if somebody was pressured into the marriage. And so it wasn't until the advent of the church that it became commonplace that women couldn't be forced into a marriage. And in fact, they couldn't even be forced to marry at all. They were truly made autonomous over their life destiny. Thanks be to the church. Even in the Middle Ages, women were given many more privileges than in other places in the world. Some Muslim crusaders during the Middle Ages, one of the things they used to mock the Christians for is they said they're weak. They let their women run around without coverings over their head. They let them run around as individuals and independents. They let them run schools and monasteries. Some Muslim invaders even mocked Christians for that. They recognized the equal dignity that Christians bestowed on their women. All throughout church history, some of the major players are women. Mary, the mother of God, the first disciples who saw Christ risen from the dead and heard the good news were women. All throughout church history, many of the main players, even doctors of the church, are women. I think it would be difficult to examine the history of any other civilization and find as many women who are the key players in those histories. It's because time and time again the church was pushing the equal dignity of men and women both. Right? The last way I would say the church has increased human dignity is through charitable works. Again, many people don't realize we take for granted today that we have nursing homes and hospitals and orphanages and countless schools and universities. Where did all those things come from? They didn't exist in the ancient Roman Empire, at least not to the same degree today. But all throughout the Middle Ages, the church was pushing the need for education, for knowledge. The church was pushing the need to take care of those who are the most vulnerable, those who are sick, those who are elderly, those who have no parents. The church is the main instigator of all these institutions that many of us take for granted today. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, okay, all those things are good, Father Bauer, but what about some of those other things? What about like the Crusades? What about the Inquisition? What about the Galileo controversy? Hasn't the church been opposed to all those efforts at progress? Again, it's not true. Many of us, our understanding of history is influenced by Protestant historians who had a very clear agenda in the early modern period, trying to go against many of the different Catholic institutions that have been established. Thanks be to God, in our modern age, in the 20th century in particular, many scholars are beginning to reverse those things. For example, perhaps the authority in the United States on the history of the Crusades and the Inquisition has said time and time again in books and in public speeches that Christians have nothing to be ashamed of when it comes to the Crusades and the Inquisition. Like any human institution governed by human beings, on occasion, atrocities were committed. But for the most part, these institutions were actually for the good civilization. As an example with the Crusades, many people think that the Crusades were all these aggressive Christians who went to the Holy Land in search of gold and land. They wanted to persecute the Muslims and the Jews to convert them. Again, that's not what the Crusades were. And many modern scholars have pointed this out. What the Crusades were was an effort to defend innocent Christians living in the Holy Land as a minority who were being taken advantage of. And those crusaders, for the most part, gave up everything to go on those crusades. Imagine if you're the owner of a vast piece of land to leave for years at a time. Imagine how much you had to sacrifice, not seeing your family, giving up working at your homestead. Many crusaders, it cost a lot of money to go on crusade. You had to find a way to feed yourself, to find shelter through all those crusades. Time and time again, modern scholars have shown that the Crusades was not a war of aggression by Christians, but Christians literally as the minority in the Mediterranean. Muslim forces were the dominant world force in the world all the way up until the 1600s. The Christians were the underdog, the minority. And that's why only the First Crusade was ever actually successful. Most of them were a tremendous failure. And yet, out of a desire to protect innocent people in the Holy Land who were being taken advantage of, the Pope and virtually every other saint in the Middle Ages asked people to go on crusade as an act of self-sacrifice and love for their neighbor. And that's what the vast majority of crusaders did. There were certain exceptions, like during the Fourth Crusades when they sacked Constantinople. Many people don't realize that those people who did that came from Venice, they were actually excommunicated by the Pope on their way there because they were clearly not authentic in their desires. So they'd already been excommunicated. Many people don't realize that. What about the Inquisition? Now, many of us know about the Inquisition and, oh man, that tyrannical force that was persecuting heretics, right? Again, that's not what the case was. In the Middle Ages, the world was dominantly Christian, and every aspect of civil life was influenced by Christianity, including the rights of governors and rulers and kings. And so a heretic was considered very dangerous to the civilization because if the kings and rulers are seen as having their authority come from God, when heresy spreads throughout the kingdom, it's considered not just a threat to religion, but also to the authority of the state. So heresy was not so much a church offense as much as it was a civil offense. And so much so that oftentimes when people are accused of heresy, they didn't have a fair trial. They were executed outright by the rulers or by the mobs. And so the church, as an effort to at least verify that those people truly were unrepentant heretics, established the Inquisition in order to give them a fair trial. That's what the Inquisition was established to do. Now again, obviously it's tragic that heretics were sometimes persecuted, but that wasn't because of the Inquisition. The Inquisition was not invented to persecute heretics. It literally saved thousands of lives of people who were accused of heresy. And even modern data shows this. In the late 20th century, many sociologists, they were given access to all the records of the Spanish Inquisition, right? The worst of all. And what they found that throughout the whole 200 years of the Spanish Inquisition, on average, only 10 people a year were actually convicted by the Spanish Inquisition. That means that over the entire history of the Spanish Inquisition, only about 2,000 people were ever actually convicted. That was less than 2% of those who were ever put on trial. Compare that to other regimes, for example, like King Henry VIII in England, who also considered heresy against the Church of England as a great offense. Over 70,000 people were executed under his reign alone after being accused of heresy. The Spanish Inquisition, in comparison, is actually much more merciful. It's not something to be ashamed of. The last thing I want to talk about is the Galileo controversy. Many of us, even if we don't realize it, even if we don't outright say it, many of us are influenced in our culture as thinking that the church has been against science, or it's been opposed to the progress of science. And you guys have heard me talk about this before. You know that's not true, but you might have wondered, well, but then what about Galileo? After all, wasn't the church afraid of Galileo's discoveries when he tried proving that the earth was not the center of the solar system? And that it was actually the earth who rotated around the sun, and the church persecuted him for it. They tortured him, they imprisoned him, they censored him. So many of us have been told. Again, the opposite is true. What happened with Galileo? As I've said many times, the main supporter of his research was the man who eventually was the Pope who censored him and condemned him to house arrest as a heretic. The reason why the church wanted new astronomical discoveries is because their calendar was becoming very inaccurate. And as we know today, it's still not perfectly accurate. That's why we have leap years, right? And so the church specifically commissioned astronomers to dive more deeply into the data and to develop a more accurate solar calendar to go off of. And when Galileo made his great argument following Copernicus, that clearly the sun was in the center of the solar system and all the planets rotated around the sun, many of his discoveries were actually welcomed with gratitude. The problem is that he couldn't prove it, just like Copernicus had not proven it. So likewise, Galileo could not. Some of the things that he argued are now considered laughable by astronomers. And yet, he refused to simply continue to call it a theory. He wanted it to be established as law. And when anybody opposed that, he mocked them sarcastically in public, including the Pope himself, who had supported all of his research. And that's why the church overreacted just a little bit. But Galileo was not tortured, he was not imprisoned, he was put under house arrest, and his writings and teachings were censored. That's what happened. Now, I want to share one last thought about this. This is super interesting. I did not know this until this past week. So before this past week, I knew that Galileo had not proven his theory. But did you know that many modern astrophysicists still claim that the theory has not been proven? Interestingly enough, I brought a little show and tell today, if you guys don't mind. I brought my phone with me to Mass because I want to share some quotes with you all. I want to share with you a quote from a very famous astrophysicist who lived during World War II. Probably the most respected astrophysicist of the 20th century. This is what he said about Galileo and heliocentrism. He said this in the 1940s. And he said this in the aftermath of one experiment in the late 1800s. It's called the Michelson experiment, which tried to prove once and for all that the Earth was in motion and the sun wasn't. And sadly enough, the experiment actually didn't work like everybody thought it did, and it failed. And this is what this astrophysicist said. He said this: "While I was thinking of this problem in my student years, I came to know the strange result of Michelson's experiment. This was the first path which led me to the special theory of relativity." This is the important part. "Since then, I have come to believe that the motion of the Earth, aka heliocentrism, cannot be detected by any optical experiment. Though, of course, we know that the Earth is moving." Anybody know who said that? Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein, even in the 1940s, said, "I came to the conclusion that the motion of the Earth could never be proved by any optical experiment." That's in the 1940s. I'll read another astrophysicist to you. This is another astrophysicist writing in 2010, which again, I'm sure you've heard of. He said this about this debate about heliocentrism. He said, "So which is real, the heliocentric or geocentric system? It is common for people to say that Copernicus proved geocentrism wrong. But that is not true. For our observations of the heavens can be explained by assuming either the Earth or the sun being at rest." You hear that? He said, "Even today, our observations of the heavens can be explained just as easily by saying that the Earth is stationary, as well as saying the sun is stationary." Anybody know who said that? Stephen Hawking in 2010 in his book called The Grand Design. Right? I just want to point all this out to you, not because I want you all to go out there and be evangelists for geocentrism. All right? I'm just simply pointing it out to you so that you don't fall for these lies that many of us have just bought from the History Channel or any other means in our culture, that the church has been constantly the oppressor of progress. The opposite is true, even in these very famous examples that are so often mentioned in our culture today.